Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Have you watched American Nightmare on Netflix? If you haven't, you should if you're a student of human behavior and psychology because there's so much to learn. If you have watched it, here's a psychological analysis of some of the psychological and cultural factors that catastrophes such as what happened in the American Nightmare case emerge out of. If you watched that Netflix documentary series, you probably have feelings of disgust and principled anger and a sense of like, how the hell is this possible? Why do law enforcement so often act as a corrupt and seemingly incompetent Soviet state? And it's so compelling to think that these are just evil bastards who should be shot. But what I'm going to argue in today's episode is that that's not the most plausible explanation for what was going on. The people involved in this were likely regular good people like you and me who sincerely believed in what they were doing. So, before I go into the analysis of the psychological and cultural factors that likely contribute to this, just a little heads up about the case. So, back in 2015, on March 25th, a couple, Aaron Quinn and Denise Huskins, experienced an intruder breaking into their house and awakening them in deep sleep. And they were obviously threatened with a gun and tied up and drugged. And Denise was kidnapped, and Aaron Quinn was left in the house and was told that if he contacted the police, they would hurt Denise. So the next day, he contacted the police, and I should say these are two, regular folks who both worked as physiotherapists and neither had a criminal record, just ordinary, nice folks. And Oren Quinn, called the police because he believed that the police would help him and investigate and do their best to get Denise back. Now, when Aaron told his story to the police, and granted, in the police's defense, quite often when a woman disappears like this, there is a homicide, and quite often it is the husband who is behind it. And the story he told seemed far fetched, of an intruder in a swimsuit, and both of them uh, having these swim goggles that were darkened, put in front of their eyes, uh, having measured their blood pressure, and it was a lot of weird stuff, with that. And of course, none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything. So, and the house seemingly wasn't broken into. So you can appreciate how it might have sounded and seemed a little bit weird. But what Detective Matt Mustard very quickly did was that he immediately started believing that this was a murder case, and he did his best to get Oren Quinn to confess to being a murderer. And he lied to him, he manipulated him, they gaslit him. So, for example, one of the things that the police did was that they had him take a polygraph. And of course, if you know anything about polygraphs, you know that polygraphs don't actually, detect deception at all. They just measure changes in certain variables in physiology. Uh, Now, the test results came back as inconclusive, but the police officer told Oren Quinn that he had decisively failed the polygraph test, and they knew he was lying. So they spend zero time going after the kidnappers, and all of their time trying to make Aaron Quinn confess to being a murderer. Now, after after a little bit of time, there was information appearing on Aaron Quinn's phone from the kidnappers, and there was a journalist who got an audio clip uh, from the kidnappers, and and also on Aaron's phone there was a clear indication that the kidnappers would keep continuing to communicate with Aaron Quinn with that phone. But what the police did is that they essentially turned it off. And had they kept it on and tracked it, they could have traced the phone of that particular kidnapper to the site where he held Denise Huskin and arguably saved her from the second rape that she was subjected to. But they didn't do that because they spent all their energy trying to get Aaron Quinn to confess to being a murderous monster. That's even the words that they used. Now, Denise Huskins was taken to this cabin, and she was raped twice, and she was threatened that if she ever told the police or anyone else that they had had sex, which is an interesting way of reframing a rape, or that the kidnapper or kidnappers had army backgrounds, then they would come after her and her family. And after about 48 hours, she was driven home to her parents' house. Now, incredibly, what then happened was that the police immediately concluded that the whole thing was a hoax. They thought it was like the movie Gone Girl with Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike that had been released the year before. And they immediately worked the angle of offering Denise Huskins a sense of immunity of sorts if she confessed. They went before they even did a series interview. The Vallejo Police Department had a national press conference where they accused the couple of being liars, said that the whole kidnapping thing was a hoax, and Kenny Parks, who was the spokesperson for the Vallejo Police Department, said that Denise Huskins had conducted a hoax and that they had plundered the community for valuable resources and instilled fear in the community. And to the extent that they could prove that, they would press charges. So now the police spend all their time, uh, you know, essentially bullying the couple and no time at all looking for the kidnappers. And they risked charges and jail time for perpetuating this alleged hoax. Now, eventually, the kidnapper slash rapist, a former military veteran who was also a lawyer, a graduate of Harvard Law School by the name of Matthew Muller. He had done several sexual assaults in the past. He had been, peeping into windows, and there was a lot of good leads on him that the police didn't really investigate. But due to this botched attempt he had, where he broke into a house, attempted to tie up the parents so that he could rape the 22-year-old daughter who lived there. He left behind evidence. He dropped his phone. They were able to trace that. And one very courageous and brave police officer by the name of, what was her name? Um, let's see here. What was her name? I suddenly can't find it here. Um, there was one particular police officer who did a great job in actually investigating. So she was the one who pushed the FBI, who pushed the Vallejo Police Department. They were all really reluctant to really investigate uh, and to look at evidence. The media kind of laughed along with them and bullied the couple. But eventually, she was able to collect a hair sample from the cabin of Matthew Muller and link that DNA to Denise Hoskins. And eventually, Matthew Muller was captured and convicted. And well, the whole story kind of ends up well in that the couple marries and they have two kids and they rebuild their lives and they sue the city of Vallejo and they get a very small settlement out of court of $2.5 million, which seems very low. But anyways, that's how it goes. Now, here's the big question: like how on earth can the police act in such a way? Are they just evil bastards? Why do they act and behave like a corrupt and incompetent Soviet state? Well, I think that the most dangerous psychological factor involved here, and the red thread, if you look at miscarriages of justice cases, if you delve into them, it's the very human tendency of confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is essentially based upon this idea that our brains are belief engines. Our brains have evolved over millions of years to detect patterns and to create patterns and to create stories. And the brain essentially starts by believing. It believes very fast. It connects patterns and often sees patterns which aren't there and create stories about it very quickly. And then we use our logic and our reasoning skills, our intelligence, more like a lawyer than a scientist. We use our reasoning skills to kind of build a case, to look for evidence that confirms what we already believe. And we tend to disregard, downplay, ignore, or quite often not even see contradictory evidence. And the very perverse, part of this is that we do this while being convinced that we do the opposite. So if you ask someone, why do you vote that particular political party, or why do you have these, particular beliefs or stances, most people will tell you that, well, I have life experience, I've used my reasoning skills, my logic, I care about the facts, and I've objectively analyzed the evidence, and I've reached this conclusion. But what the psychological science more points in the direction of is that we're more likely to start by believing and then using the reasoning skills to essentially build what seems to be a watertight case for what we already believe while being convinced that we're doing the opposite. How, why on earth are we doing this? Well, if you go back 100,000 years to when Homo sapiens were living in East Africa, on the savannah, let's say you were walking along, and Michael Shermer writes brilliantly about this in his book, The Believing Brain, which I highly recommend. So I've taken this particular analogy from him. If you walked on the savannah and let's say you suddenly heard some sort of sound in the grass or something like that, well, it could be a predator or it could just be the wind, essentially. Now, if you immediately kind of believed that it was a predator and responded accordingly, then if it's just the wind, of course you're fine, unless you happen to run into a predator somewhere else, obviously. But you're fine. Now, if it actually is a predator, at least you have a head start. But if you were to kind of step back and reflect and think and evaluate, and it's just the wind, you're fine. If it's a predator, you're lunch. So, this ability to have believing brains that did confirmation bias was probably an extremely useful and necessary survival tool for much of our history. The problem is, in today's complex societies, that very same tendency to engage in confirmation bias might be our biggest psychological issue in terms of getting along, in terms of the pursuit of truth and justice, in terms of miscarriages of justice in the legal system, and the resistance that innocence lawyers are often met with, even when they can demonstrate with DNA testing that their client is actually innocent. So it's very likely in this case that the brains of the detectives have immediately seen some patterns, spun a story, and believed that it was a murder case. And then the brain selectively looks for evidence of that and discards everything that doesn't fit. And of course, as soon as people commit to a stance and they start to argue in favor of it, and they go out in the media and they kind of argue for it, and their whole team is behind it as a group effort, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. It takes a lot to turn around and to reevaluate and to reconsider one's position. You know, even having a high IQ or having a high intelligence in the classical sense won't necessarily help. Michael Shermer, the guy I just previously mentioned, in his one of his other books called Why People Believe Weird Things, he writes about highly intelligent people and how they can often be the last people capable of actually examining their beliefs, because just like with everyone else, they tend to start by believing. They end up believing for non-smart reasons, but then they often have an increased capacity, an increased verbal capacity to actually argue for and defend their beliefs. So calling these people idiots and stupid, it's not necessarily a case of stupidity either, even if people, for all intents and purposes, in cases like this, act stupidly. And confirmation bias runs so deep. It even influences forensic science. Now, a lot of forensic science is actually junk science, whether it's fingerprint analysis or tire parts or bite marks or you know all sorts of stuff. A lot of it is more or less handwriting analysis. A lot of it is more or less junk science. But even with the stuff that's borderline legitimate and legitimate, suggestion and beliefs can carry an enormous influence on how forensic scientists operate. Quite the contrary to what TV shows like CSI would have you imagine. People often have this idea of forensic scientists as these objective, dispassionate researchers in the lab, but they're hired by the state. Essentially, many of them are police officers with lab coats. They get fed information from the police. They collaborate with the police. So I'll give you a scare. There's a lot of studies like this that you can look up, but one interesting one is if you look at the work of Itiel Dror, the Israeli neuropsychologist who's based in London, has done a lot of interesting studies on the topic of confirmation bias. So, for example, in 2005, he and his team did this brilliant study on fingerprint analysis. And what they did was that they took five, well-established experts with decades of experience, a lot of courtroom experience in using fingerprint analysis. And what they did was that they told these five experts, here are the fingerprints of a suspect in a particular case, and here's the hair, here's some hair sample I want you to examine. Um, Now, they also told them that this particular case is a case where most people have reached the conclusion that there was probably a miscarriage of justice, that this person was actually innocent. But just overlook that, just ignore that, and see if the hair sample is a match to the suspects. Now, they tricked the five fingerprint experts. What they did is that they gave the fingerprint experts samples of hair from people that they had previously in court concluded that was guilty. So both the original hair and the other sample hair was old hair samples that these experts had confirmed were a match. And what happened, just the suggestion, the belief that this person is probably innocent, got four out of the five hair experts to suddenly disconfirm, to go against their own initial findings. Only one out of the five experts, rendered the same verdict. And you see study of this too, in the lab when forensic scientists get told by police officers that, oh, we want you to do these toxicology reports or blood samples or hair analysis or tire analysis or bite mark analysis or fingerprints or whatever. The only thing that seems to escape this is DNA for the most part. Oh, by the way, he just confessed. He confessed he's guilty, but we still want you to do the, you know, in experiments like this, there's a way higher rate of the results coming back being a match with the predictions of law enforcement. And this has happened too in quite a few cases where DNA testing later shows that the person is actually innocent. So very, very tricky. And of course, remember, most police officers are not educated really in topics such as this. They're typically not psychologically minded. If you speak to psychologists or if you speak to lawyers and police officers, uh, some may have some training in witness psychology and stuff like that, but for the most part, they're kind of illiterate when it comes to stuff like this, uh, and that's a big problem. And if you read books like, for example, Duped by Sol Casson about false confessions, or you read books like the excellent Blind Injustice by Mark Godsey, which is an excellent book of a former hard-ass prosecutor who turned innocence lawyer. He writes about these typical cases of what's called the co-ejaculator. So he writes about getting DNA evidence that proves that their client is innocent and has spent 20 years behind bars for a crime that they haven't committed, and initially having this naive belief that all I have to do is to give this evidence to the district attorney and they're going to call for the person's release, and that almost never happens. What usually happens, due to confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, is that the police officers and the attorneys dig in their heels and they fight even more harshly. So they might concoct some sort of theory that, oh, this just means that even if the person did those things, their DNA miraculously didn't, end up on the scene, or they suddenly introduce the idea, let's say it's a rape case, that, oh, this doesn't mean that your client is guilty or innocent. He's just as guilty. It just means that he had a co-ejaculator, with him, a fellow rapist who ejaculated and your client didn't. So your client's still guilty, but now we have to look for his friend as well. These are these are typical these are typical um, responses. I remember looking into Norwegian cases of miscarriages of justice. There's a guy called Fritz Moon who's deceased, but he was convicted of two separate murders that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And in the first one, of course, there was no DNA evidence. There was no witnesses. There was no evidence. It was just the police deciding that he was the one and creating this confirmation bias-based investigation based upon it. When it went to court, they discovered that he actually had an alibi for the time of the murders. So the police just moved the time of death with like 12 hours, and the judge said, okay. And then it wasn't his blood type, but they flew in some eccentric expert from Copenhagen who had this weird theory, and if you allowed his theory, then maybe, you know. And the final one was it wasn't his sperm in the murder victim's vagina. And but once again, the prosecutor just said, "Oh, but today's young people are so promiscuous. She probably had sex with someone else. He came. She didn't shower. She went out, got raped and killed by this guy who didn't ejaculate." And then the courts go, "Bravo. That's obviously how it happened." Sounds horrible, but if you do a deep dive into these miscarriage of justice cases, you find that many of them are this crazy. Even here in Norway, it's the same stuff that you see in the American Nightmare movie. And so other factors here too. So for example, when you look at the interrogation techniques that Matt Mustard and these other folks use at the Vallejo Police Department, it's confession based. It's based upon trying to get a confession, uh, you know, really, really fast. And most of the interrogation techniques, especially in the States, is based upon the Reid method, which is based in lying and manipulating and gaslighting uh, to get a suspect to confess. And of course, the fact that the police have these sorts of confession methods alongside the typical myths that many of them believe in, that they can read deception by nonverbal cues such as body language and micro expressions in the face or statement analysis. This is all bullshit, by the way. I made another video about this recently on the Provocative Hypnosis channel that you can look for and watch. But a lot of police officers believe in this and are even trained in this. The work of Paul Ekman, for example, has influenced law enforcement a lot. Um, and it's quite scary. And if you look on YouTube, there's the behavioral panel. These four interrogation, law enforcement, military, body language alleged experts who are trial consultants and stuff like that, and they have over 800,000 subscribers, and they are perpetuating the exact same myths that you can read deceptions based on micro expressions in the face and statement analysis and they seem to be trained in the Reid technique as well. Now, here in Norway and parts of Canada and Wales and the UK and some other places, there's different interrogation techniques that are not confession based. And these do increase the odds of getting an actual confession when it's right, and it decreases the risk of false confessions. And police over here, are prohibited by law to lie. But the culture, even here in Norway, is still horrible. The local police in the city that I live in, for example, in Kongsberg, are horrible. They're like a Soviet state. They're known for. I've experienced this myself in dealing with law enforcement. They're known for, writing false reports and creating articles in the local newspaper that the police themselves have invented. Um, and even there was a case last year of two guys who were beaten up by the police. They were kind of gangsters. They were assholes. But the police beat the crap out of them and filed charges that these two guys had attacked the police, which was not true, right? And then someone had taped it. So they took the phone, and then the police officers sat down and they wrote these false reports about what happened. So they essentially tried to orchestrate deliberately a miscarriage of justice. And the only thing that saved those two asshole gangster types was that someone leaked the video from the gas station. One of the police officers was charged for violence, and one got like a bit over like $1,000, $1,000 fine for hiding evidence, which is nothing, you know. But the fact that they tried to orchestrate a miscarriage of justice and wrote false police reports, no charge whatsoever. So we also have a culture where police are used to getting away with stuff like this. You have, and then you have a couple of other factors as well. The police, fierce, strict in-group loyalty, a chain of command, very hierarchical, right? And the identity of being the good guys. So and that's also scary. This identity that police officers, create, that they are the good guys. They build their self-concept and their self-esteem based upon this idea of belonging to the right tribe, essentially, and being the good guy. What do you think happens to a lot of these people when evidence starts to come forth that suggests that they have contributed to the wrong person being in jail for 20 years? And they may even have cheated and hid evidence and falsified reports and done a lot of shady stuff. What very easily then happens, due to confirmation bias, but also just the protection of that good person identity, is that even considering that information, it challenges who they think they are. It challenges everything they've internalized. So they're likely to sweep it under the rug and to completely ignore it. And if someone else has to sit 10 more years behind bars innocently, while they can maintain the identity and facade of being the good guy, that's the most important thing. And one thing we know in law enforcement is that very often, and I see this here in Norway, whistleblowers or people who question, decisions or show psychological independence are ostracized and severely punished. It's career suicide, to do so. And you can imagine too that the people who end up as leaders in law enforcement are those who completely internalize, the whole system, and it essentially becomes part of them, and they are part of it. And so if there's any information that seemingly attacks it, it's an attack on them, and they're going to demand the same obedience from anyone else who wants job security and who wants to climb the career ladder as they have displayed themselves. And what you see perversely too in this particular American nightmare case is that Matt Mustard, the the investigator who really acts like a Soviet state, uh, bureaucrat, in the way he deals with this. Instead of being reprimanded or retrained or fired, he actually gets promoted to, an Officer of the Year award. And I've seen this back home here as well. It reminds me of what was called the Monica case. Quite a few years ago, there was this 8-year-old girl who one day was found dead in her home, and her cell phone was missing, and the window of the front door was broken into, and she was hanged, and the police concluded suicide, right, and just would not do any more investigation. And there was one heroic cop who wasn't even assigned on the case, by the name of Robin Schaefer. So Robin Schaefer was not even assigned on the case, but he looked at it and said, this just doesn't seem right. 8-year-old girl, suicide, broken glass, her phone is missing. She had no signs of being depressed. Her mother said she was happy. Like, this doesn't seem right. And he wanted to investigate and to look into it, even on his own spare time. And he was ostracized by, by the police where he worked. No one wanted to be friends with him. His chief officer, wanted to fire him and kind of moved him around. He was treated like crap, but he kept, pushing for this case. And it was discovered that her stepfather, who actually killed her, or the mother's boyfriend, I should say, did not really have an alibi, at all. And it took nothing, to investigate and to confirm that. And he was able to press on, and after time get cooperation from people higher up in the chain of command outside of Bergen, that particular city. And he kind of became the hero who cracked the case. And then everyone wanted to be his friend and stuff like that. But the funny thing is, he was not promoted, but the incompetent chief who just concluded suicide and refused to look at anything else, she was promoted to a higher position. So you see this madness quite a bit, in law enforcement, and that's exactly what you saw in the TV series as well. There is something, in law enforcement, you often get these law and order types. The whole culture encourages conformism, obedience, obeying the chain of command. So you're less likely then to get curious people who are prone to think about how they think. That it's one thing to internalize a culture and a cultural surround, and to become a part of that and have that become a part of you. What the developmental psychologist Robert Kegan would call the socialized mind, right? There's a difference between that and a person who has taken a step back from his cultural surround and has his own thoughts about police work and challenges, is trains himself to look with a critical eye at what they're doing and why they're doing it, and develops that inner seat of authority. I'm not saying that there aren't people who have that more self-authoring capacity in law enforcement. There surely are, and there are heroic, skilled police officers. But most of them probably don't operate there. It's more this conformist in-group loyalty. And when you get these conformists who rise to the top in a chain of command, or people with dark triad personality traits, which you're also likely to see, you get a culture very often where prosecutors and law enforcement, essentially operate like a sports team, where they're trying to get to get the most confessions, trying to get the harshest convictions. They're trying to win cases. It's all about their own, them kind of competing as a sports team, you know. And there's another excellent Netflix documentary, by the way, that's called "Don't Pick Up the Phone," which is about this guy who calls these fast food restaurants all over the U.S. and pretends to be a police officer and concocts this story where the manager has to interview one of his female employees, um, and him being a police officer over the phone, and it starts quite innocently, but then it progresses to violence and sexual abuse and all sorts of stuff. And the shocking thing is his success rate, meaning how many managers of these restaurants he's able to talk into doing violence and torture and sexual assaults against their female employees just because they believe that he's a police officer. And if you watch this documentary, it's just a staggering high success rates. And you see that, as we know in hypnosis, when people are uncertain, they tend to look to the one who seems the least uncertain, as a leader, for guidance. So just because they believe he's a police officer, all critical thinking goes out the window, and they just go into this conformist, obedient mode. And it's so sad to watch because these people are not people, they're not criminals, they're seemingly normal, good people who haven't done anything wrong and wouldn't have done anything like that hadn't they been told so. But the reality is, most of the people would be concentration guards at Auschwitz, and some of them would even enjoy their jobs. The old conformity experiments in psychology from Salomon Asch to Stanley Milgram show this quite decisively, right? But those are in the lab. The really interesting thing is if you watch the Netflix documentary, Don't Pick Up the Phone, this is real life. This is the Stanley Milgram experiments done in real life, and the outcomes are depressing, right? So, and if you look at that good guy identity, I remember I asked this private investigator and journalist here in Norway called Tore Sandberg, who has been instrumental in getting 8 people exonerated for murder who were innocent. And I interviewed him, and I asked him, in any of these cases, has any of the judges or media people or police investigators or anyone involved in the scandal sincerely apologized or done anything, shown any remorse, done anything to make things a bit less tragic? He just started laughing and he said, no, no one ever. In fact, they do the opposite. They try to hide evidence and they try to distort things. And he said something to me which I'll always remember. He said, remember, they're good people, or they have the identity of being a good person. And they're good because they do these good things, right? So acknowledging, looking at something like that would just be so psychologically threatening. Now, there's there's something else here too. Like people, if you look at this couple, Oren Quinn and Denise Huskins, law-abiding people, good people, they believe in the police. And most people tend to believe that law enforcement works for the public. I would argue that it doesn't. Law enforcement mainly works for the bureaucracy that it's part of, and the power structures that essentially, the states. And law enforcement, they might fill out their forms and do their protocols, and to the extent that they've done that, they've followed the chain of command, they've done their job. Whether that helps anyone or not, that seems quite secondary. So I think a lot of people get confused with that. And then there's a kind of final factor here as well. There's probably many other factors that I haven't thought about, but there's another factor here as well. In addition to, like if you look here in Norway, all the cases that I talked about, the miscarriages of justice, no police officer or detective or prosecuting attorney or judge has ever been reprimanded in any of these cases at all. So there's literally no skin in the game, you know. So given that most people would be Nazi prison guards, you know, uh, and if you look at law enforcement, there's probably more than a fair share of people there who would have been Nazi prison guards, just due to the psychological temperament of many of the people who seek out a career in law enforcement. Think about it. So while there are heroic cops who are willing to do what Robin Schaefer did in the Monica case, or what the cop whose name escapes me did in the American Nightmare case, those are not the norm. The norm are the conformists, the obedient types, and the people who are seeking to advance their own career within the system. And they will align with their in-group. They'll be way more likely to do that than to question anything. And a final thing, let's not sweep under the rug, you know, um, professions such as law enforcement does attract more than its fair share of people with dark triad personality traits. I'm talking about psychopathy and narcissism and Machiavellianism. So when the psychopathy researcher Kevin Dutton, more than a decade ago, did the great British psychopathy survey, where he was looking for in which professions in the UK do you find the most people who have psychopathic traits, law enforcement or police officer came out as number 8. Top one was CEO and then lawyer. Shouldn't surprise anyone. Then you had like sales and media people. You had surgeons, which again shouldn't really surprise you. But they're attracted to these professions where they can yield power and dominance over other people. And if you look at psychopathy as a personality construct, it essentially, the hallmarks, in addition to having little to no conscience or ability for remorse, there's a callousness. There's a callous, cold sense of truly not caring about anyone else's welfare. You combine that with a kind of bold, fearless, assertive personality style with little fear and anxiety, and also a tendency to kind of be disinhibited. So if you look at it from like a big five thing, you have people who score high on certain facets of extroversion, not all of them, but on excitement seeking, and assertiveness, essentially high on those. If you have someone who scores high on those, and they score low on neuroticism, meaning that their tendency to anxietize and feel fear and stuff like that is really, really low. You combine that with the extroversion, you get that bold, fearless, dominant, personality style. And you have low conscientiousness, on top of it, where you get that kind of disinhibited thing going on. That's kind of the marker. Now, these folks who are quite often charming, and they lie and they manipulate and they have little guilt or conscience, and they know how to play the game, and they love to exercise power. You'll have more than your fair share of people with psychopathic traits in law enforcement. And these folks will very often know how to climb the ladder. So whether it's politics or law enforcement, you'll see these people with these personality tendencies, whether it's as prosecutors or chiefs of police, and you can imagine the type of fear-based culture that encourages, and you combine that with the in-group loyalty, and the confirmation bias, and a system that, this is the important part too, a culture and a system, a legal system that kind of rewards, amplifies, and reinforces the confirmation bias, right? So, for example, here in my native Norway, the prosecutor's office and police investigators are the same branch, and in low and middle court, there's no recording, uh, neither audio nor video, and the judges have free evidence evaluation, meaning that they're completely free to evaluate evidence or call evidence whatever they want. So it essentially means that if they feel that you're guilty, they can say that you in fact are guilty. You know, so combine that with people who are generally psychologically a bit illiterate, not psychologically oriented, haven't learned about these biases or how memory works, and you're prone to have more of these scandals. And then of course you have the media, which very often becomes a lapdog and a mouthpiece for law enforcement. Um, but here's the thing. I think if you watch American Nightmare, you see that this isn't unique to law enforcement. This thing about confirmation bias, this is our software as Homo sapiens. And I strongly think, of course, since I believe it, I see it all over the place, right? That's confirmation bias. But I truly think that confirmation bias, which worked really well in the past, is way more detrimental than it's useful these days. And we as a species have to find a way to dampen down our confirmation bias. We have to build in procedures and checks into our legal systems. We have to investigate the investigations, so to speak. We have to get better at thinking about our thinking and being aware of these sorts of things. So that we can reduce the types of scandals that we've just seen in American Nightmare. I hope this was useful. I'd really enjoy hearing your comments, what you think, whether you agree or disagree. If you're watching this in February or January 2024, know that I'm doing my next psychological illusion model online training February 17th and 18th. If you go to provocativehypnosis.com and you hit the seminar page, you'll see a link, you'll see information. I also do mentoring with people all over the world, people who want to explore hypnosis, psychotherapy, NLP, hypnosis, that type of stuff. And if you want to see if you and I could be a good fit in terms of working together as a client, you can contact me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.